Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Support Your Workforce in Critical Times. Our speakers today are Liz Fosslien and Molly West Duffy, co-authors of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, No Hard Feelings, The Secret Power of Embracing Emotions at Work. Liz and Molly will guide us on how to best support our people during these incredible times. Liz and Molly, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us at whatever time it is where you happen to be. We're glad to be here with you. So again, we are Liz and Molly. I'm Liz. I'm the head of content at a company called Humu, and we nudge people towards better ways of working. A nudge is a really small suggestion that makes it easy to take the right action. And you'll see what we try to do throughout this presentation, what I do in my work, and what we've done in our book, No Hard Feelings, is really try to give people tactical advice that you can start to put into practice immediately after this webcast. And so now I'll hand it off to Molly and let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Molly West Duffy. I am an organizational design expert and previously worked at IDEO, now work at a company called Rally. And I'm excited to be here today, also the co-author with Liz. So as Liz mentioned, we wrote this book. It's called No Hard Feelings. Came out a little over a year ago. And the premise was that we all have emotions all the time at work, but it feels like having emotions at work is not professional. So we wrote this book to figure out what emotions are helpful to express, how do we harness them, how do we communicate them. And really the thesis that we came down to was recognizing that if we don't address or acknowledge our feelings at work, they come out in unproductive ways. It's not that they go away. And so the best thing is to acknowledge them and learn how to actually use them in a healthy way. So that was all pre-COVID. Even more important with COVID. So today we're going to talk about emotions in this context, in a remote work context. And there's three topics. One is leading with empathy. We're going to talk about how to reconnect with your team, and then how to be what we call being selectively vulnerable. Kick it off with leading with empathy. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks. So one of the big questions that we've seen people discuss that we've gotten, that we've also gotten at Humu, is really questions from leaders asking, how do I think about empathy and priority and productivity in this time? So obviously everyone's going through a lot, and at the same time, leaders feel pressured to keep the business running, to ensure business continuity if and when offices reopen. And the answer that we always have is that empathy is the best thing you can do for productivity. So if people are scared, if they feel overwhelmed, if they're kind of just under a fire hose of things that they need to do, they're going to get stressed, they're going to burn out, they're not going to be productive. So leading with empathy, and we'll go into a few specific ways that you can do that, is actually the best thing that you can do in this moment to enable your people to still be productive. And so again, a few tactical ways to do that. So the first is, I'm sure everyone has seen this already. I think unprecedented is maybe the word of the quarter, but it is a time when there's no rule book, there's no guidebook. It's unclear how to handle a lot of these situations. I think we're seeing that really with how people are considering going back to offices. It's not a uniform thing. There's not really guidelines. And so just understanding that everyone has always had emotions, and now they're going to be at a different level than they used to. And a big part of that is also being conscious of where people are emotionally. Some people are caretakers for elderly parents, some people have kids at home, some people are living alone and have been now for a couple months, and that can be extremely isolating. And so I had a friend recently who said, when people ask me, how are you? My answer is always, in this moment, fine, but ask me in another moment and I'm not sure. And so one of the things to do, given that people are going to be cycling through mourning their old lives, maybe even mourning the loss of a loved one, mourning because their loved ones are far away and they can't see them, is really to make all social events opt-in. And we'll talk about reconnecting teams in a bit. I think it's a wonderful drive that a lot of people are feeling to schedule virtual happy hours, to do fun events with their teams that are distributed now. even with friends, but it's really important as a leader to communicate. If you can't make the 4 p.m. happy hour on Friday because you have to take care of kids, or just because you're completely burnt out and you have Zoom fatigue, that's fine. This is not a time to kind of be checking who's attending these events. It should be something nice if people want to take part in it. Another thing is to really emphasize learning goals and efforts. So this is, performance right now. It's harder to measure than it used to be, and partly because it's measuring things like access and availability and caretaker status. So really, as a leader, emphasizing that you appreciate people's effort, that you want them to take this time to learn, to experiment, to try new things. This is also, in a way, a fresh start because people are working remotely often for the first time, so they need to set new norms with their teams. But really, again, emphasizing the effort, appreciating that, and not making it so much about this needs to happen on this day. And implicit in that is building in a little more flexibility. And then the last one that we really, really emphasize in every presentation about leadership is to emotionally proofread your emails. So you want work as much as possible to be a source of meaning and to be support, like a place of support for your people. You don't want to pile on anxiety, especially if it's unnecessary. People's plates are already incredibly full. And what we mean by that is there's a big difference between sending an email that says, let's chat, or we need to talk, especially if you send it late at night, and sending an email that says, I got your deck, appreciate the efforts, I have a few minor edits, let's find 15 minutes to connect tomorrow. Totally different response. And so, quick visual illustration, imagine if you get this email from your boss, you're gonna question why it was sent so late, you're gonna analyze how it was addressed. This is obviously when we were still back in the offices, but you're going to be really confused and you're immediately going to be like, I'm getting fired. And so as a leader, you want to prevent people from going down these unnecessary anxiety spirals. So the question that we'd like everyone to think about for a moment, and if you want to add your responses into the questions module, we'll have Paul read those off in a little bit, or if we don't have time, get to them during the Q&A. We'd just like you to reflect on what steps you or your organization have taken to lead with empathy. So at Humu, one thing that I really appreciate is we have a daily stand-up where people can share kind of anything that's going on in their lives, and that's at a time that works across multiple time zones. And then we've also done, early on, we did Friday afternoons off because people were still transitioning and trying to figure out so many logistics. And that was a really nice way of the company saying, take the time you need to settle into your new routines. And now I'll let Molly share something that her organization has done.
Yeah, so my organization has done a couple things. The first is we do start by reflecting at our weekly staff meeting about the week and what's happened, and just create the space for emotions to come up as needed. We also have really upped the amount that we are checking in with teams about how we are working. So quite frequently we'll say, what's been working well about how we've been collaborating remotely this week? What could we change? Knowing that we all are trying to figure this out. No one is an expert on it. And so we're going to have to iterate a lot more. We're going to have to experiment with team dynamics and giving each other feedback and all of that. And so taking an experimental approach to it and reflecting back on it has been really helpful.
I love that. Paul, is there anything in the questions module that's been popping up?
We see a lot of questions coming in, but I don't think the audience has had quite enough time to reflect on that particular question. So I'm going to monitor this and report back at the end of the presentation.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we will definitely have time at the end to take your questions.
One more, just to give folks a little more chance too. One more example I'll give that we heard was a leader just acknowledging that, and we'll get to this too at the end, but leaders acknowledging that they too are struggling. So saying things like, I'm dealing with anxiety right now, but just sort of putting it out there, creating the space for it can help create the space for others to display empathy and set the tone for that as well.
Hey
Yeah, I
guys,
love
so
that.
after I said
Oh,
no stories, a
yeah.
really great anecdote just popped in. So let me share one quickly. We have done sharing of professional or personal stories to start out each meeting. We use a prompt that changes for every meeting. We circulate who is responsible for coming up with the prompt.
That's great. I think it's a great practice as well to circulate or rotate. We have in all of our meetings, we rotate who takes notes and who sends out an agenda. So I think that's also a nice way of making sure participation is equitable. So thank you, whoever read that in. So a big part of leading with empathy is also helping your team combat stress. And again, this is part of having the workplace be a source of support as opposed to just another source of misery in a world that's already quite stressful, as we mentioned. So a few ways to do that. And the first one, this seems very simple, but is actually, for me personally, has had enormous benefits, and it's to schedule 25 or 50-minute meetings. So if you're used to being in an office, you also go from one meeting to the next. You're standing up, you have time to go to the bathroom, grab a snack, you're chatting with people. It's this sort of informal moment when, one, you're getting a break, you're getting some physical activity, and you're also getting to connect with your coworkers. And that doesn't exist if you're going from 10 to 10:30 Zoom to 10:30 to 11 Zoom. It can be really hard to build in those times to just, even if it's just do 5 jumping jacks. And there's so much research that shows that these little quick breaks do a lot to increase our productivity, make us feel better, and just, ultimately help us combat burnout. So making sure to build those times in, and the nicest way to do this, especially as a leader, is to make it explicit by having these little 5 and 10-minute breaks built into people's days and calendars. The next is, and this is especially useful if you have one-on-ones, is to always offer to switch to phone calls or emails. So especially for introverts, and Molly and I are proud introverts, it can be exhausting to have back-to-back video calls. And a large part of that is because when you're on video, you're looking at yourself, which is incredibly unnerving and unnatural. And you're also, the only way we can communicate that we're paying attention is to kind of look directly at the camera. And if you're in person, you can walk together. You're never really standing 3 feet away from someone, staring them in the face for 30 minutes. And so that's exhausting. And so one thing to do is just to check in. It can even be on video and say, hey, this meeting doesn't need to be on video. Should we switch to a phone call? Would that be useful? We could both, if possible, go for walks outside and call each other then. So we also build an activity. And then also just looking at your meetings and thinking which of these could be emails. And I'm sure people, if you let them know, I'm guessing many would also be relieved at the break. This is also a time of extreme job insecurity. So you might be thinking my team is really productive, but that might just be anxiety-fueled productivity as opposed to the kind of productivity that supports creativity and innovation, because people are motivated by meaning, not by this fear that they're going to be fired or laid off. So one of the ways to combat that stress is really to show you value your team's contributions. And that can be just asking for their input on a big decision. It can just be showing gratitude, praise, thanking them, but just finding small moments to tell your team, you matter, I appreciate the work you're doing. And again, this goes back to appreciating effort and emphasizing learning goals. Another way to really build meaning is to share stories of the people your work impacts. So again, it can feel, I think, especially in the earlier weeks, it felt like, to me, the world is ending and everything is meaningless. But it was really nice for me to reflect on, well, there's still people that my work is really helping. And so I'm still doing something, even if it feels maybe slightly smaller in the grand chaos of things. But really finding ways, connecting your people with customer stories, even if it's just reminding them, meaning means different things to different people. So for some people, it's, I have this job so I can pay for my family. For some people, it's, I have this job because I love my team. And for others, it's because it makes a positive impact on the world. So whatever it is, helping them reconnect with those stories. And then finally, as a leader, you play a great role in setting examples. And so I really, really encourage you to take a day off. One thing is to also look, if you're a leader, at benefits usage. So are people actually taking vacation days? Are they, what's going on? Again, this is an intense time of job insecurity. And so the best thing you can do to encourage people to take vacation is to actually take one yourself. And that means Try not to answer emails on that day. In the long run, a day off is not going to end the world, and it can have huge benefits in terms of how your people feel, if they feel supported, and whether or not they actually are going to take the breaks that they need as well. And quick illustration of that, it's not just work that makes us productive. It's all the things we also do to kind of preserve our senses of self and our health and our mental well-being. So with that, I will hand it back over to Molly.
Thank you. As one other thing I'll add for setting up the 25 and 50-minute meeting defaults is there is a setting on Outlook and on Gmail to do that for you, which makes it very easy. And then I've also seen several organizations do more company-wide shutdown days. So if people are not taking vacation, considering like taking off or just shutting down the company for the whole week of July 4th, or adding on a weekend to a day to a weekend, but just sort of enforcing it, because definitely that is true that people are taking less vacation than they would right now.
And one last thing I'll add, this is Liz again, is we had a discussion internally at Humu about doing something like that. So adding on the Friday ahead of Memorial Day weekend in the US. And we realized that people would not have enough time to plan, especially if they have kids, to give themselves that break. And so also being cognizant, don't spring a vacation day on people. Say like in 2 weeks, you'll have the day off so that they can actually plan for it as well.
Great point. All right, so how to reconnect to your team. So really, this extreme remote environment, it can be hard to think about how to stay connected. So we had actually done research on remote teams for our book before all of this started, and we looked into what matters for remote teams. So looking at physical distance, does physical distance matter the most for having a sense of connection? Does operational distance matter, or does affinity distance matter? And affinity distance is the one that really helps teams stay connected. So what affinity distance is it's the strength of connection among coworkers. So even if you work across time zones, and even if you have like a lot of things that come up operationally that get in the way of communication, if you feel strongly connected to your coworkers, it can transcend those other two barriers. Okay, so how do you do this? How do you build more affinity distance? So the first one is to make any time that the team comes together a positive interaction. And I know that a lot of us are having time at the beginning of our meetings with teams where we have to check in about how we're doing emotionally, and I think that's still helpful, but it does mean that you can start a lot of meetings on a down note. And so trying to think then about how do we move into a positive space to do the work. So maybe that's transitioning into what's one thing that we're grateful for before we start doing the work, or what's one thing that's been working really well even though we have been remote, or what is an unexpected positive of us having to work remotely as a team. So switching into that. The second is creating something called an It's Okay To list. And this is a list that we wrote about in our book that is a poster-sized list that was created by someone at the UK's Government Digital Service Office. And it's a list of things like, it's okay to sigh, it's okay to take a break, it's okay to take a walk, it's okay to ask a question, it's okay to not know the answers to everything. And what it's doing is making these permissions explicit. So often when we join a new organization or we are younger in our careers, it's like, I don't know what I'm allowed to do, what is allowed, what is permissible. Then slowly over time, we figure it out. And now we are all new to working remotely. And so we're all figuring out what is permissible. And I think having a conversation as an organization to create this is a really helpful activity. So we did this with an organization recently, and things came up like, it's okay to turn your webinar or your video camera off for some of the time during the day. It's okay to work 8 hours a day, but not necessarily always between 9 to 5. It's okay to not show up to all of the company happy hours. And it just, like, by doing this thing together, you are surfacing these questions that people have, and you can make a decision of like, yeah, that's okay, or maybe no, that's not okay. You know, like we do expect you to be working from 9 to 5 still because that's when our clients are. So really, really helpful. We like thinking about printing it out. Obviously, in the digital context, you can't do that, but even just pinning it on Slack or however you do it in a Google Doc is really helpful. Don't forget about praise and gratitude. So research shows that the most common time when we get praise and gratitude is all these in-between moments in our day. So before a meeting, after a meeting, walking down the hallway, it's like, hey, great job with that last meeting. And we miss those in-between moments now. And so make it a habit at the end of every day to reach out to someone and say, you did a great job at that meeting this morning, or I think you're doing a really good job with that work stream. Just make it sort of like a shutdown ritual at the end of every day, because you didn't most likely have a chance to do that in the in-between moments. Aligning on outcomes and expectations. So again, I think we do have, when we are in person, we have more time to chat before and after meetings, pop into each other's office to be like, hey, is this what you were thinking? Were we going to get this done by the end of the week? How far along did we want this to be? And we do these things almost without thinking about them. And now suddenly we don't have the space to do that, we have the space, but it's all in a very formal meeting context. And so it is very easy for expectations to get out of line. So you talk to someone on Monday, you think you know what you're doing, they think they know what you're doing. By Friday, you have delivered something, or you're checking in about it, and it's like, oh, that's not at all what I was thinking, or, you know, and so planning a little bit more frequent check-ins can help on that. And then also, like in the upfront, asking all of those questions. These are sometimes the like worry word or silly questions, but like if you're getting an assignment from someone, like getting way more granular. So thinking about, okay, how are you envisioning the outcome of this looking? What progress are you expecting me to make along the way? What would a bad version of this look like? So trying to sort of draw yourself a more narrow box. And doing this together as a team can be really helpful. And then continue to check in on each other. So as Liz mentioned, like it's like, yeah, if I ask you how you're doing and you answer, I can't assume that that's how you're going to be doing later on that day or tomorrow. So continue to check in. On the other hand, we have also heard that it can be sort of exhausting for some folks to be talking about how they're feeling all the time. And so as a team, you want to try to get a read on like, as individuals, who wants to be checked in a little bit more frequently, a little bit less frequently, and calibrate. So one of the things that we've all been hearing a lot is, how are you? We hear that all the time. We hear that in the beginning of every call, and it's like, it's really difficult to answer. And so what we tried to do is create a list of more specific, granular questions that you can use as a manager or with your team that help someone answer that question in a way that is a little bit more actionable. So instead of asking, how are you, you could say, what is one thing that I can better do to support you? What kind of flexibility do you need? Is anything unclear or blocking your work? And then how are you investing in your resilience right now, and how can I help? What these questions do is they set up an easy answer, because it's not like, how do you need better support? It's what's one thing I can do to better support you. So they're making them much more specific. So we'd encourage you to, copy these down. Again, you can follow along on Twitter to see the slides as well. We found these to be really helpful. So we'd love to hear from you. Again, you can either just reflect on it yourself or share in the questions. What are you doing to take care of yourself in these times, to reconnect with your team in these times, to help your team stay afloat in these times? We'd love to hear in the questions.
And this is Liz. Oh yeah, go ahead, Molly.
No, go ahead.
I was going to share a few things that I've found really useful, both. So one thing with my team, and then one thing that I'm doing by myself. And with the team, it's been We did, with people I work with frequently, we did a sort of calendar meeting audit. And that was, we have all these meetings that we do every Monday, every Tuesday, every Wednesday, every Thursday, and they're sort of still relics of when we were all in the office, and it just felt much easier and nicer to get together. And so we've gone through those and thought, okay, is this one that we really want to keep? Also, given how much priorities have shifted since COVID started. And so we were able to clear some time off of our calendars, and that is really nice. It gives me more time to do heads down work. I think it was a great exercise for our team to really think through which are the meetings that are important to us and that we want to keep, and which are the ones that we could probably just resolve. We could solve some of the issues or have the discussions on Slack instead. So that's one thing. Another thing has just been really meticulous about taking notes. It's not possible that everyone can make every meeting, especially some of my coworkers who have children. And so just making sure that they still have access to all of the information discussed in that meeting. And then one thing I've been doing for myself that I find really useful is I've been trying really hard on Sundays to not look at my work email whatsoever and to get outside. And so I'm very lucky to live in the Bay Area where there's lots of opportunities to go hiking. But I found that just the physical shift has a huge impact on my mood. And so I think that speaks to also the importance of just exercise, of even if you can, just walking around the block. It's sometimes I definitely wake up on Sunday mornings and don't want to do it, but it always, always makes me feel better. So a few tips there.
Great, thanks, Liz.
And Liz and Molly, we have a few good suggestions, not surprisingly, from the audience. One is to share funny moments. Another is someone who's booking virtual lunches to connect with people less formally. I bet this one's pretty common. People walk their dog every morning before they sit down for work, and some other good ideas that are floating in.
That's great. Thank you. Before we move on really quickly, I love the setting up informal lunches because it also builds this muscle of actually taking that time off. And one addition that I would encourage is to try and set up lunches with people, and especially if you're a leader, you can facilitate this. So set up lunches with people that aren't on the same team, you know, maybe have them put their name in a digital hat and then they get randomly assigned to a group of 4. One of the risks when we work remotely is that silos really deepen because you really tend to just look towards the people you know, the people you work with, and then those other people in the office that you would see in the kitchen, you just have no interactions with. So making sure that you're still communicating with everyone boosts innovation, improves inclusion, has all kinds of good outcomes. So still being mindful of who are the people that you're reaching towards to set up these casual interactions.
One great way to do that is there is a app, if you use Slack, called Donut, D-O-N-U-T, and it makes it really easy. You just put everyone who wants to be paired into a channel, and then it takes care of doing the random matching for you. So just make it as mindless as possible.
Great, thanks. So emotional expression, this is a big one that we were asked a lot about before COVID, and then obviously since even more. This is a time, again, we've said this many times, but it is, we're all feeling so many things at all hours of the day. And so we've gotten a lot of questions from managers, executives, leaders. What should I do? How much should I express? What's the line between oversharing and undersharing? And so before we lay out sort of some practical tips, a few things that leaders should consider when it comes to emotional expression and what the research shows. So the first is that some emotional expression builds trust. So this idea that tends to be very traditional of leaders always being calm and cool and collected, and this notion that what's quote unquote professional is to be fairly stoic, actually doesn't do much to build trust or make people feel like you're a human that they understand. And you know, a great example of this is the current situation, which is if you just start every meeting with an agenda and you never check in on emotions, you never speak to the fact that you're struggling as well, that this is a difficult time, people will not only feel isolated, but they will really I mean, it doesn't feel human. So it's very easy then to look at someone and think, who is this person that's not feeling any feelings? And then it makes them a little uneasy, because if it seems like everything in your world is totally fine, but it's not in theirs, then there's a disconnect, and then that causes uncertainty. So again, if you show no emotions, people will likely assume you're a calculating robot and they won't trust you. But then on the flip side, if you're showing so much emotion, if you're just sort of having an anxiety attack in every meeting, that's going to undermine your credibility as a leader, and that also will destroy trust. So there's a nice balance in the middle. People also respond positively to empathy. So the question I like to ask here is, think about the manager or the leader that you worked for that you were most inspired by and most motivated to do great work for. And it's usually not someone who is stoic. It's someone that you had a personal relationship with, that you felt like you could turn to when you'd made a mistake, that you could ask questions, that seemed really invested in your success as an individual. And so the flip of that is, that's the kind of leader that you should aspire to be. And lots of research shows that when our bosses are supportive, we perform better, we have a better time remembering important information. It sort of cascades out to all of these positive outcomes. As a leader, your mood also has an outsized impact on others. So there's this great quote. One of the people we interviewed for a book was Kim Scott, who wrote Radical Candor, which we highly recommend. If you haven't picked it up yet, definitely a great read. And she said she thought that as a manager, she was doing this wonderful job of keeping it all together, being an emotional source of stability for her people, until one of her reports came up to her and said, I just want to let you know that I know what kind of day I'm going to have by your mood when you walk in the door. And that's when she realized that she wasn't all buttoned up and keeping it in. And so if you're a manager, and this goes back to emotionally proofreading your emails, it's really, really critical to think through what are the signals that you're giving. And it might be nonverbal. So your body language, where you're looking, if you seem extremely distracted on a one-on-one video call, that can also make someone feel insecure, especially again, now that kind of everyone's a little worried about their jobs. So really just thinking, understanding that what you do can really ruin someone's day. And then Molly, in a few minutes, will give some tactical tips on how to do that. And then again, same concept. Your team looks to you and can read you. So anytime that your team feels uncertain, they are going to turn to you and very critically analyze everything you say. So again, in the current environment where many people are getting furloughed or laid off, you say a small comment about the business and people are going to think about it a lot and try and think, what does that mean for me and for my future? And so being as transparent as possible, but holding this in your mind, that you also want to share a message that's concise and clear, so that again, it doesn't cause unnecessary stress, that you're kind of stating things as they are. And then, so again, small things that you do can have a huge impact on how the people who report to you feel. And here's a quick illustration of that. And I will hand it off to Molly to give some tactical tips based on that research.
Great, thanks, Liz. All right, so yes, selective vulnerability. So what we mean by this is opening up while still prioritizing the stability and psychological safety of your team. Really tough line to walk, but really important to share, which builds trust, and then not overshare, which destroys it. So the first one is figuring yourself out. So the first couple moments, minutes, hours after you've had a strong emotional reaction to something, you may not be able to pinpoint exactly why you had that emotion or even what that emotion is, because you are still in the middle of it. So taking a step back and saying, okay, I'm feeling extremely frustrated right now. Let me take a walk around the block, whatever I need to do, so that I can figure out what frustrated me and how I can articulate that to my team so that I am sharing it with them in a productive way. So an example of this is that I used to be a consultant at IDEO, led a lot of teams, and I felt myself getting extremely anxious and uptight and frustrated one day. And I realized that it was because I'm somebody who really likes to get things done ahead of time. I hate procrastinating. I hate leaving things until the last minute. And my team was tending towards that direction. So once I was able to figure that out, then I could go to them and say, you guys know me. I really, I hate procrastinating. I know that that's unusual, but like, what can we do to make sure that we're getting this done on time so that I can take a step back and just trust what's going on with the team? And so we talked through the timeline, and I trusted them. I was able to take a step back. But if I had just gone to them in my moment of extreme anxiety and frustration, that would not have been a great conversation. The next one is figuring out your own emotional expression tendency. So this is part of figuring yourself out, which is knowing, am I an over emoter or an under emoter? So you could go to this website, and Paul or Allison, if you can actually just type this link into the chat for us, and then folks can just click it directly. We're going to ask you to go to this website right now and take this assessment. It should take about 2 minutes to fill out. And you can come back once you've done that, and we'll talk about the results. So what this is going to tell you is whether you are an under emoter or an over emoter. And what that means is how easy or natural it is for you to share your emotions. If you are an over emoter, you are going to be somebody who naturally, people know what's going on with you. It's not a surprise what you're feeling. You're going to be wearing your emotions on your sleeve. Great, thank you for that, Liz. The link is now in the chat. You can follow that there. If you are an under emoter, you are going to be somebody who tends to hold your emotions a little bit more closely to your chest. People will have a harder time reading what you are thinking. And so how this shows up in a leadership context is if we can be more aware of our own tendencies as leaders, we can be more aware then of how our reports will likely be reading or not reading our emotions. So I'm going to give you all another minute or so to go ahead and do that.
And something interesting, there's also, I think, a poll will be showing up. So once you've taken the assessment, we'd love to know, and you can see also how other people fall on the spectrum. And I think an additional point is this can also change depending on the context. So for example, I am definitely an over emoter in my personal life, and at work, especially when I'm new to an organization, I'm much more likely to be an under emoter, and that changes over time. But even just understanding that allows me to think, okay, I've just started at this job or on this team, or I've just started working with this person. I need to kind of correct a little bit because my natural tendency will be to pull back. And then in my personal life, sometimes I need to pull back a little on the over emoting. But just to point out that it's not a fixed trait necessarily, context matters, and your emotional state matters as well. Oh yeah, and there's the poll. So after you've taken the assessment, or perhaps some of you know immediately without taking the assessment which one you are.
This can also be a really helpful assessment to do with your full team. As I mentioned earlier, there are some folks who I think bristle at being asked, how are you all the time? And those folks probably fall a little bit more on the under emoter spectrum, because it's like, it takes energy to share how I'm doing, whereas the folks who maybe want more of your time checking in about how they're doing probably fall on the over emoter spectrum, because they're like, I would like to tell everyone how I'm feeling, and so the more people who check in, the better. And again, one isn't good or bad or right or wrong, but it's just helpful to know that.
Oh, and there's our poll.
All right, pretty even split. Interesting. Great, that's like a perfect distribution. Incredible. All right, great. So if we can go back to the slides then. All right, so then the second one is flagging your feelings without becoming what we call emotionally leaky. So one of the things we talk about in the book is how emotions can spread. So you can actually have what's called emotional contagion. And the way that works actually is if I'm in a bad mood and I go to work and I spread that bad mood to my colleague, and then my colleague goes home and is in a bad mood and she can spread that to her partner, it can transfer all of the way from me to somebody that I don't even work with. That's how far emotions can spread. And so by flagging your feelings, you can prevent them from spreading. So what this looks like, again, we talked to Kim Scott and she said, you know, I had a bad morning this morning and I'm going to walk into my team and say, you know what, I'm not in a great mood. I had, you know, dealing with kids at home or dealing with traffic back when we had traffic. And I'm just sharing this with you because the last thing that I want to do is make your day worse with my bad mood. It has nothing to do with you. So I think copping up to this idea of like, you don't have to have a great day every day as a leader. You are a human, but people are going to be looking at you as a leader longer and harder for your emotions. And they're going to be reading into those emotions more of like, well, the boss is in a bad mood. Is that because of something that I did? And so you want to be extremely explicit of like, hey, I'm just frustrated. It has nothing to do with you. Puts it out there. You can move on. Next one is providing a path forward. So part of being selectively vulnerable is sharing the things that you maybe are feeling vulnerable about. Like, you know, I'm feeling anxiety about the COVID situation as well. But as a leader, you unfortunately don't get the luxury of just feeling anxiety about it. You also have to decide what to do with the company. And so you want to pair any sharing about what are traditionally labeled as negative emotions, so frustration, anxiety, fear, anger. You want to pair those with, and here's what we're going to do to make it better. So great example of this in a COVID context, a leader said, you know what, I am having a lot of anxiety about this. And it reminds me a little bit of the period after 9/11 when I had a ton of anxiety, and I honestly wish that I had shared a little bit more about how I was feeling, because I think I bottled it all up and that wasn't helpful. So it's being vulnerable. At the same time, I want to share with you that we aren't planning any layoffs in the next few months. We are going to do everything we can to keep this business afloat. Here's what we're asking each of you to do, and here's what I'm committing to do. So you are like pairing it with a path forward, and people are really looking for that at this time. Putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So part of being selectively vulnerable is able to say like, all right, I know that I'm the leader, but if I wasn't the leader, what would I want from a leader at this time? Like, what am I craving? And, you know, I think we all wish that we had someone to tell us it was going to be okay, but you can step outside yourself and say, you know, okay, what would I need to hear right now if I wasn't the leader? And then reading the room. So difficult when we're not all in a room together, but as much as you can, creating space in meetings to understand what is necessary. So are people looking for you to be a little bit more vulnerable or a little bit more reassuring? And that may vary greatly depending on, you know, what's going on and how folks are feeling. I know in our all hands meetings, just creating a little bit more room for white space for folks to share what they're needing and how they're feeling. Great. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left here. We would love to move into Q&A. We will turn our videos on. And if you want to share any questions that you have in the question chat area, and Paul can help us read them out.
Yeah, hi. So first of all, that was great, and not surprisingly, flood of questions coming in. So we'll get to as many as we can, and thank you to everyone in our audience for the fabulous questions. Let's begin with something that a point you made at near the very top of the presentation. I think you acknowledged that even as we're using the word unprecedented time, the word itself, maybe it's beginning to lose a little bit of meaning because we've said it so many times. How do you think about mixing up the message? So while we continue to acknowledge that we are in this fill in the blank time, it doesn't dissolve into something that feels like a rote acknowledgement.
Yeah, I can answer, and then Molly, feel free to jump in as well. Um, I would say trying, if you can, to make it more specific to the situation. So instead of just the rote, this is an unprecedented time, giving updates as well. So one thing at Humu is we've been really thinking about what should we go back to the office. Obviously, there's also state regulations. And so I think the leadership team has done a really, really wonderful job of saying, there's no guidebook for this. We're not sure. They actually did a survey of all of the people at the company. So that update was like, this is unprecedented. So we're going to ask you how you're feeling. Let us know. And the survey asked questions like, do you feel comfortable coming back? You know, if we could come back, would you want to be back full time? Would you want some kind of flexibility? Would that look like 75% in the office, 25%? You never want to come back to the office. So I think it's, you know, you can mix up the word unprecedented. I think we can all move away from that probably a little bit, but really tying it to what's actually going on, and then as much as possible, inviting feedback. I think it's a great way to also incorporate that bit about asking for people's input to show that you value them, and also just to show them your contribution matters, your job is secure, you're just a really valued part of the organization.
Great.
Yeah. A couple things I'd add to that. So again, I think the more specifics, the better. And one way that we've seen leaders do a great job with that is reaching out, again, depending on the size of the organization, but reaching out to have one-on-one conversations with everyone. So by doing that, I think you have a more in-depth understanding of what's going on, and you can say, you know, here's specifically what I'm hearing from all of you. If you can't do that, then doing something like a survey so that you are responding to not what you think people are feeling, but what they actually are feeling. I think metaphors can be really helpful right now. So one of the things I've been talking a lot about is that this feels like a long distance relationship. I don't know how many folks have been in one, but what I've been saying is it starts to feel normal, but it gets harder. So it starts to feel like, well, this is how it is. We no longer see each other, but at the same time, the longer we go from seeing one another, exponentially harder it gets. So we get used to it at the same time as it wears on us. And looking for other ways to define and use metaphors to describe the feelings that we're feeling right now. I think Liz also mentioned, I mean, we've gone through so many phases of this. So I think we can say, well, what new phase are we in? Are we in the weary part of this? One of the leaders I was talking to the other day said that he's talking about it as days. So he's like, okay, so it's day 72 of quarantine, and that's this new phase. How are we doing in day 72?
Yeah, what's so interesting about that is almost we have to keep recontextualizing that as we go, right? Because we don't know, we're on a journey that we don't really know where it probably doesn't end, right? But we don't know when it even begins to approximate something we constitute as normal, right?
Yeah, one quick thing I'll add to that. I love the long distance relationship analogy. I hadn't heard that. That's great, Molly. Is kind of similar. I also heard a leader describe it as it's similar to just sort of chronic pain or grief, where when something first happens, there's a lot of support from your community. People are asking questions. It's something new to talk about. And then as it goes on, it's this thing where it's like, there's not a quick solution. And I think, I'll say, especially in America, we just don't really know how to handle that. So it's just like, what else is there to say? We've talked about it. It just feels like bad, and we don't really want to get into it. And I think that's why in this presentation, we put so much emphasis on keep checking in, because the morning isn't over, right? I still have and granted, I have a great life, all things considered, but there's still flashes of my parents are in Chicago, I'm in San Francisco. I don't know when I'm going to see them again. And that hurts some days a lot. And so I think it's really nice when my boss just says, how are you? I know, and especially if he brings that up again, like, I know this is something that you've been thinking about. Just want to let you know that I'm thinking of you. Even something as simple as that. There's no easy solutions. As a leader, I think leaders often have this instinct of, I need to fix everything. I'm in charge, I can control it. You can't fix everything right now. You have no control over many, many things going on in people's lives. And it's still really lovely to just do that quick. I'm thinking about you. I know this is still a thing. just kind of putting it out there and giving space to that.
So that connects really well to a theme I'm seeing amongst a number of people, and that is kind of talking about what we actually mean when we talk about empathy, particularly as this experience extends further and further, right? I think we associate empathy as a psychological phenomenon, wrong word, right? But something that is expressed in words. But should we be thinking a little bit more broadly about empathy as doing, not just saying?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, whoever brought that up. And I do think it takes even more effort in these times, because a lot of what we're doing is just talking to each other. And so what does that look like in terms of action? And it's mainly going to be conversational at this point. You can't really walk into someone's office. Although we have heard some great examples of companies sending physical gifts in the mail, which we recommend. It could be something fun like sending I heard one company sent a pineapple to everyone because it was like an inside joke for their organization. But even just, a handwritten letter from a leader can be really, really helpful. But yeah, I think the best way that I found to talk about this is assuming good. So giving folks the benefit of the doubt. That's really what empathy comes down to in this moment. So I think in the beginning, I heard a lot from leaders of like, I don't think that my report is they're not as productive as they were in the office. Like, I think they're sitting at home talking to their partner, baking all day. And it's like, yeah, that may be true. Like, I don't think any of us are as productive as we were. A lot of us are talking more to our partners because there's no one else around. And we are all certainly, cooking and baking more. But where that comes from is an assumption that I'm not getting the best from this person anymore. And so giving them the benefit of the doubt while still addressing it. So going to them and saying something like, I know that we're all trying to figure out what productivity looks like. I didn't feel like this specific report was quite as rigorous or whatever it was as I expected. So let's sit down and talk about my expectations for this. And again, going back to that, how can we align better on my expectations for this without telling yourself a story of what they did or didn't mean to do?
I love that. I think it's such a good reminder. And to quickly add on to the action piece, another great thing, so I've heard of companies that will say, here's a $25 voucher so you can buy lunch for yourself, and it's a great way too to support local businesses. And then I think Molly mentioned this earlier, but just give everyone a day off. That's not a holiday. I think that's a real act of empathy, which is, again, it shows we're putting our people first, and that's, obviously, like, it does help productivity, but I think it's a really nice message. It creates that explicit space. And then small things too. In our book, we share, I think it's Shonda Rhimes, who's written many TV shows, is wildly successful. And she has on her email after 7 p.m., if someone emails her, it sends them a message back that says, I'm not responding to email. I'm spending time with my family. And if you work for me, I recommend you do the same. And that's not, it's still words, but it's an action of, there are boundaries. I want you to take this time.
Let's talk about that paranoid baking boss a little bit. Not from the leader's perspective, but from the team member's perspective. How do you address, something that was implicit in your presentation in an optimistic and affirmative way is that people want to be good leaders right now, and they have at least some inclination of how. They may be fumbling around, but they have best intentions. But how do you address those leaders that don't understand how important it is to embrace empathy, who are just missing it somehow?
Yeah, this is a common theme, across the board that we get asked in our presentations, which is like, if I'm not in charge, how do I change it? And I think the honest answer is, well, if you feel like you are in a safe enough position to give that feedback, to that person directly or to someone who works with that person, I think that's always an option. Usually that is paired with, I don't feel safe doing that. And so I think then it's like, okay, so what can you control? And you can control modeling that behavior for yourself and for your colleagues. I also think that the best way to do this is to enter in a conversation modeling the behavior that you would like to see, and oftentimes the other person subtly picks up on that and mirrors it back. So even if the power dynamics are such that you as the report are modeling that to your boss, we are humans and we mirror off of each other. So what that might look like is, let's say that your boss is not being empathetic, you start every call with them and they're just like running through the to-do list. You could start a call by saying, hey, I actually haven't checked in with you recently. I'd love to hear how you're dealing with having kids at home. Or, hey, I'm noticing you're working a ton. Like, I want to make sure that you're getting the time off that you need. So whatever you would like to hear, maybe try mirroring some of that back.
One, I'll add to that as a sort of more direct message to leaders is, I think we're in a time when it's very easy for unempathetic leaders to get a false sense of security. Because if you look at things like retention, I'm sure retention is extremely high right now, but that's just because people are terrified to lose their jobs. Productivity might be spiking, especially if you've started to really say, I need you to be more productive. But again, that's not actually an indicator that people want to invest in your organization, that they're going to be there long term, that they're finding motivation, and that they won't burn out quickly. And Molly and I have written about this, but we firmly believe that in 3 years from now, a big question that candidates will ask is, how did your organization and leadership team respond to the COVID crisis? And that is going to determine how your people answer that question, will determine the level of talent that you attract, retain. And so I would say a lot of the metrics that leaders love right now are not measuring what you want them to measure. And so don't let that comfort you. If this is the time for empathy, it is the thing that in the long run you are going to see has the highest return on everything you care about, and wonderfully is also the best thing to do for your people.
It's like hearing you say that, it feels like, leaders should have a big poster that says people will remember plastered, in their home office or their kitchen or wherever they're working from. I mean, it's so important to keep that front of mind. We've got time for a couple of more questions, so I'm gonna pair up two. One is kind of advice. You both mentioned you're introverts. I am also a proud introvert. Love to hear some thoughts on how to help introverts open up. But then the flip side of that is, how do you tend to the needs of extroverts, right? You could say working at home is the introvert's revenge.
Yeah, I'll start and then throw it to Molly. For the introvert question, a great way is to think of non-video based ways to connect. So Slack, at Humu, we've done a lot of fun Slack threads where a prompt is like, respond with your favorite emoji, or respond with a GIF or GIF that shows how you're feeling today. And that's just a really nice way. If someone sees it an hour later, they can do it then. So I think introverts really value time autonomy and asynchronous ways to have fun address that. For extroverts, I have a friend who's extremely extroverted, and he called me recently and said, I understand how you feel after the 4th hour at a party. I finally get it. This is torture. And so for them, I think, if you're a leader, making sure that they have time for one-on-ones with you, it's wonderful to set up these virtual happy hours, and that's where extroverts can really get together, connect. But again, it's building flexibility into anything so that it's not mandatory, and it's so you want to create spaces for people to connect, but not make it mandatory, not always make it video.
Great, thank you. Molly, did you want a last word?
Yeah, last thing I'll say is, a lot of companies are having happy hours right now. And I think one way to satisfy the needs of both introverts and extroverts during that is making them more structured. So introverts do best with structured fun, where they know what's expected and when they're supposed to speak. And extroverts generally like happy hours.
Great. That brings us to the top of the hour. Liz and Molly, thank you very much. This was a really wonderful presentation and conversation. And to our audience, thank you as always for the wonderful questions,